Good day, lovely viewers, and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. And welcome to the fifth and final week of Anoraknoween! And thank heavens I'm not talking about a double album again that would require being split into 4 parts of a long video just to save up some space and time. But not only that, I'm finally actually talking about a Pink Floyd album. I know, this long into this little show that talks about reviews of rock albums from old age, and only now I get to decide to talk about a Pink Floyd album? Weird, I know. But before I get into that, allow me to discuss a bit of the backstory behind this band and how they were at that point. After 1968, when Syd Barrett left the band due to drug issues, the Pink Floyd were trying to find their identity post-Syd, trying to find what kind of music they really wanted to do, or what kind of music they wanted their fans to listen to. In 1969, they released 2 albums, a soundtrack to a film called More, and a part live, part studio double album, Ummagumma. Then in 1970, they released Atom Heart Mother. One side consisting of the titular suite, which combined orchestral, rock, and other avant-garde elements, and the second side consisting of individual kind of experimental tracks, each of them being written by a particular member, including Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. After that, they didn't really know where to go from there, and they didn't really have a kind of theme to go off from. So they decided to just mess around, experiment, and improvise a bit, hoping to find what kind of music they liked making, and will eventually kind of expand upon that and kind of mix them together into some kind of conventional album. And the result of that is the album we're looking at today. And it may be a special occasion, since, well, this album has turned 50 years old. Yes, it was that long ago. And that title of that album is none other than simply Meddle. And the cover itself may seem almost as weird as the music itself, but once you actually closely observe it, or have someone actually explain it to you, it's basically all simple. It's basically just a close-up of an ear underwater, as you can see from the little earlobe, the hole, and the various ripples scattered across the album cover, possibly referencing collecting sounds like the song Echoes in the album. Like most of the Pink Floyd albums, the artwork here was done by a famous art group, Hipgnosis, and the story behind that is something else entirely. You see, apparently, when they first came up with this album, the folks behind Hipgnosis suggested that the cover be, well, a close-up of a baboon's rear end. Yeah. They want, after having nothing but simply an image of a cow for the previous album, they wanted to follow up on that with a baboon's rear end. Yeah, you can imagine why the band didn't go with that idea. And apparently, they actually kind of didn't really like that idea, as apparently over a phone call conversation, one of the band members joked that they would rather have an ear underwater. So they decided to just go with that, and the rest was history. And apparently, looking back at it, one of the more famous members of the Hipgnosis group, Storm Thorgerson, has felt some dissatisfaction with the final result, saying, and I quote, "I think Metal is a better album than it is in its cover." And apparently he went so far to say that it was his least favourite album cover to work on. And his fellow member, Aubrey Powell, shared similar thoughts, saying, and I quote, "Meddle was a mess. I hated that cover. I don't think we did them justice with that at all. It's half-hearted. And I could agree with them, but honestly, between this and a close-up of a baboon's behind, I'd rather go with the underwater ear. And much like the album afterwards, this too is a gatefold. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, I love me some gatefold. Because not only does it show the actual individual members of the band, but on the outside, it shows more of the actual ear, so you could properly tell what it actually is. So, with that interesting backstory out the way, let's actually overlook the actual musical content of the album, and see if it still holds up after 50 plus years. We begin Meddle with One of These Days. This mostly instrumental piece, and I do say mostly, which I'll get into in a bit, it starts with this simple yet unsettling sounds of wind and blowing, giving off a feeling of being lost in a storm. Then, about a minute in, we're introduced to a very deep and hoppy bass sound of Roger Waters and the fading in, striking chords of the Hammond organ by Richard Wright. And through this, it builds up this suspenseful mood, as if you're being pursued by some kind of dark stranger or something. Then halfway through, it then delves into this deep bit of like strange sounds and these otherworldly I'd say melodies, but it's kind of hard to label them that. It wouldn't exactly feel out of place in a Doctor Who episode or something. And throughout it has this kind of rippling sound of like some kind of bass or a guitar being constantly playing in and out, kind of rippling like between the ears or something. Honestly, I could easily hear something like this in, say, Wonka's Hell Tunnel or something. And then we get to the bit of the lyric of the song, if not the only bit of lyric here, which is pretty much the phrase of, "One of these days I'm going to cut you into little pieces," spoken by none other than the Pink Floyd drummer himself, Nick Mason. And apparently, according to some sources, this was apparently a response to a particular DJ that the band kind of felt annoyed by due to their rambling or something, and threatening that they'll probably cut up his nonsense into pieces or something. Then, of course, it then spirals into this awesome hard-rocking climax with David Gilmour's slide guitars, and while it still follows the same melody as the beginning, it still feels like a hard, awesome climax. It may not be the most heavy metal of Pink Floyd's song compared to something like the Nile song from the Moore soundtrack, but it's definitely still one of their more heavier stuff, and it's probably no wonder why this song was made a single off the album. And as the high energy gets bookend and drowned out by more sounds of wind, we then come to the next song, A Pillow of Winds. And by absolute contrast, this song's more soft, more calm, more light and comforting. It almost feels like we've been through like this intense nightmare or some level of stress and pressure across one of these days, and then when we come to this song, we're finally relieved that stress. We're finally waking up from this bad dream, and honestly, it's a very good contrast. I do like this choice of putting these songs together by that little wind transition. It's mostly an acoustic track with a lot of electric and acoustic guitars kind of taking the lead, with the bass, organs, by and what little drums are. And by drums, I mean hi-hats. Basically, just hi-hats, really, all kind of taking place in the background, essentially. And in terms of lyrics, it's mostly a psychedelic ballad where Gilmore sings about sleeping and dreaming and just being with his love as the darkness falls away and the sun kind of rises up for the morning and kind of glistening over this hazy morning. It's almost a bit like a stream of consciousness. There's even a bit of it where Gilmore says how she locks the door and a book falls to the floor. It might just be there for a bit of rhyme, but it is kind of an interesting bit of writing there. And in it, there's, like I said, there's barely any drums in it aside from the basic hi-hat. That kind of goes to show how very, very calm this is compared to the previous song. And honestly, I don't mind listening to a song like this when kind of waking up or just sitting on a chair and watching the sun rise for the morning. And the title itself apparently was originated from a hand in the game of Mahjong. I couldn't find any exact source to confirm that, and as someone who hasn't exactly played Mahjong in a long time, I can't exactly know if that's actually true, or if the term Pillow of Winds actually did come from the game, or it's just kind of like inspired by a similar hand in the game. It's still very possible, but overall, this is a very chill, very relaxing Pink Floyd song, and to anyone who may be put off by the more harder, more heavier material, I'd gladly recommend this one. Next is Fearless, another acoustic song of sorts. This too is also co-written by Roger Waters and David Gilmour. In this, the latter sings about, well, being fearless, climbing even the steepest of mountains, rising above the tree lines and clouds, and doing it all in his own special way. And when he sings the bit of you look down and you see the faces of the crowd before you or something like that, I think it kind of refers to how the band would look out into the crowd as they perform on stage, which is a interesting, almost autobiographical feel to it. Kind of explaining how they would eventually face their fears or stage fright of performing music in front of the whole public, how they would accomplish their ambitions and goals. And that line is also kind of fitting, as by the end of the song we get to meet this very well superimposed recording of Liverpool stadium fans singing a rendition of the song "You'll Never Walk Alone" from the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical Carousel, which in itself kind of fits the theme of being brave, kind of fighting obstacles, overcoming said obstacles, and just all around being determined and confident in what you may do. And it could also be interpreted as being about the character of Pink from The Wall earlier in his life and career, singing to himself in second person about entering into the business of rock and roll and music, and having to play his music on stage in front of the crowd, even when his wall is still in the midst of being built and constructed to the point of near alienation and isolation. It might not be intentional, since this was years before the wall was even thought up of, but considering how Pink Floyd often already had these common thematic elements anyway, I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. Next is Saint-Tropez. Named after an actual town in the south of France, this little jazzy, groovy track was written and sung entirely by Roger Waters himself. And basically, it paints a picture of what life would be like in that particular town. Spending a little holiday and all, if you're alone, I'll come home, etc., etc. The music itself does share that kind of chill and carefree vibe to it, especially with Gilmore's little slide guitar returning, a bit more calmer this time compared to One of These Days, and even having a bit of a Hawaiian taste to the ears, as well as Wright's little piano solo near the end, giving off this very jazzy club style to it. This is definitely what I would call a holiday song, on par with, say, Grantchester Meadows, for instance. And honestly, this is the kind of song you would probably listen to while wandering out on the beach in the middle of day, or just wandering down like an old tropical town like in Barcelona or Sri Lanka. And it's another very chill song from the Pink Floyd band, and like I said, if you like the more relaxing music, if you've had a bit enough of the more intense and heavy stuff, this is another one I'd recommend checking out. It is also a good example of how Roger Waters' songwriting isn't always about these dark, intense themes like insanity and war and politics and all that. Sometimes he can write about something very simple, very fun, and very relaxing. I've heard some people interpret this as kind of a subtle allegory for World War II, but I haven't found any sources to confirm that was the case from Waters' perspective. But still, different interpretations are still fine if they do have some valid sense to them. And all in all, Saint-Tropez is a very chill and very happy-go-lucky tune. Side 1 ends with Seamus, the shortest song of the album at about 2 minutes and 15 seconds. This bluesy novelty song basically consists of David Gilmour playing on his typical guitar and singing about how he's in the kitchen and Seamus is outside, and honestly, that's pretty much it for lyrics. These are very, very few lyrics here. Not as less as, say, One of These Days, but definitely a lot less compared to other Pink Floyd tracks. And across this little song, we're accompanied by the constant howling of the actual dog named Seamus, who was owned by Steve Marriott of Humble Pie and Small Faces fame. And Pink Floyd themselves would eventually go on to record dog sounds for the song Dogs for the Animals album, and even Dogs of War for A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Apparently, according to some sources, David Gilmour at the time was taking care of the dog Seamus for Steve Marriott, and decided to, I guess as a little joke or just as a bit of fun, David decided to record the dog barking in the studio to go along with this kind of little bluesy improv track he probably came up with along with Rick and Roger. And honestly, I guess you could say that Seamus was a guest collaborator for the song, similar to someone like Roy Harper and Claire Torrey, who both collaborated for Have a Cigar and Great King of the Sky respectively. Though I hope that band do credit that dog and give him some royalties. Animals should have some consideration. But all that said, many people have considered this one of, if not the worst, Pink Floyd song ever, both from fans and critics and all else. Honestly though, looking back and listening to it, I can understand where they're getting from. It can be seen as heard as just a bit of filler, or just the band mucking about with someone's dog that didn't even belong to them. But honestly, if you take it all as just a little in-joke or just a fun piece of fun and humour, it's not too bad. I'd be hard-pressed to call anything the worst Pink Floyd song. Just some that aren't as good as memorable as others. This may not be as deep and thought-provoking as more well-known tracks from the Floyd, but it's honestly one of the more lighter and more fun, more, I don't even say cute. I'd say this is a very, very cute song from a band that's more well known for their bizarre, psychedelic, and often darker songs like The Final Cut or The Wall. It's fine for such a band to have some more like fun here and there, and yeah, it's not exactly the best Pink Floyd song, but it's not exactly the worst either. And so side 2 begins and ends, if not the whole album overall, with the 23 to 24 minute epic Echoes. Starting off with those iconic ping sounds that were made by a high piano note being played through a Leslie speaker. They get accompanied by what seemed to sound like distorted sounds of distorted water droplets, as well as the return of David's sliding guitars. Then it evolves into this grandiose jam section where Dave and Rick pretty much share singing in like a sort of unison, if you will, singing about albatrosses and rolling waves and kind of a common theme of like waves and just like coral reefs, just simple, vague, but also very hypnotic imagery. Originally, apparently, Roger Waters originally written some lyrics to be about two planets or celestial bodies meeting face to face, but he decided to rewrite it all out of fear of being seen as a mere space rock band. Then, the the piece then kind of trails off into into another little collage, into a little funky bit with the guitars and the organs kind of playing off each other. Then we reach into the core of Echoes, where we were subjected to these strange and otherworldly sound effects, including like constant whirring and brief crow calls and what sounds like high-pitched sirens. It's like we're in the core and center of some dark void, or we have transcended to this whole other atmosphere. Then soon enough we eventually rise out of the darkness as the darkly sounds kind of fade away, and this this long ongoing organ chord kind of comes into play, and other instruments follow suit as well. And then after some heavenly orgasmic guitar play, we return to reprise that little vocal section before we have one last rock off, and then for this last bit, we come to this glorious climax where it gives off the sensation of being in a rocket ship rising up and just being blasted off into space. For such a song, I'm at a loss of words for a song like this. It's no wonder why many people praise it as one of, if not the best song from Pink Floyd. In fact, if it weren't for this song, we may have never had The Dark Side of the Moon. This pretty much laid the foundations for what would be to come for the Pink Floyd band. Not only wouldn't we have Dark Side of the Moon without this, we wouldn't have the likes of Wish You Were Here, The Wall, Animals, The Final Cut, Vision Bell, etc., etc. And, of course, to address a little elephant or flying pig in the room, there's of course been the accusation that Andrew Lloyd Webber kind of lifted a bit of this song into like an overture, into his overture of his Phantom of the Opera musical, and listen to some comparisons. There are definitely definitely similar, but I'm tempted to brush it off as coincidence. Mind you, there's no proof that he actually didn't know about it. It's just we don't exactly know for sure if he actually did deliberately plagiarize the song, or if it's just like a really cool sounding chord and progression. He just kind of just wrote it up and just kind of threw it into his little musical. Even Roger Waters kind of decided to not make a big deal about it, while kind of making something of a big deal about it, but that's neither here nor there. I'm not talking about Phantom of the Opera, I'm talking about Echoes by Pink Floyd, and it is absolutely stunning. It's a stunning piece with several movements. It's up there with the Atom Heart Mother Suite and Shine On Your Crazy Diamond. And honestly, overall, Meddle by Pink Floyd is definitely a monumental album in Pink Floyd's discography. And considering the albums that came afterwards, that may be saying something. If it weren't for this, we would never have Dark Side or War. Sure, some of the songs in between may drag for a bit, like Shameless, for instance, but still, I still like the song for being a bit of a mood break, or at least a little bit of a breather in between some more deeper, more intense tracks like Fearless or One of These Days. Some of the other songs like Pillar of Winds and Sandra Pay, they also have that kind of chill vibe to them. All in all, this is a very chill, very relaxing album, despite some intensities like, well, One of These Days. And even then, that too is a great epic opener to such an album like this. And I'd say I'd recommend it, but let's face it, a lot of Pink Floyd fans out there have probably already listened to it. But if you're a newcomer, if you want to get into Pink Floyd and you want to listen to their music, you want to listen to how they started, how they evolved, this is a high recommendation. This is a high demand, and honestly, Meddle, it may not be as well known as Dark Side or The Wall. It still deserves some recognition and still deserves some appreciation. And so that concludes Anoraknoween. I like to apologise that this month hasn't exactly been the most Halloweeny, and especially with some of the subjects I reviewed these past few weeks. But I hope that you still enjoy them so far, and maybe next October or the one afterwards we'll cover something that's more fitting for the theme. For now though, I hope you have enjoyed Anoraknoween. Next week though, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of another classic album from another classic 70s rock band. And I'll give you a hint of this one. If they don't go out like a lead balloon, they go out like a Led Zeppelin.